You on this now. Believe your own eyes. That was the prosecutor's final admonition to the jury in the Derek Chauvin trial. And John Podhoretz of the New York Post writes that that should be the admonition governing the public response to this horrible tragedy. Believe your own eyes, Jen Psaki, he writes. Your thoughts?
That's right. And John went on to say that she all but characterized this as an illegitimate race-based shooting. And look, when you stand at that podium, your words carry weight. And I think that, at this moment, jumping to that conclusion was incredibly irresponsible. I remember taking the podium after the horrific George Floyd video came out. And we acknowledged that tragedy and said, this is tragic. This was terrible. This was hard for President Trump to watch. But then I also did this. I went on in the briefings thereafter to say what good, hard work our police officers generally do. I said, look, there are cases of injustice and we must go after those. But what about the police officer? And I went state by state, the police officer who jumped in freezing water to save people. What about the police officer who saved a baby from choking in another state, or one that thwarted a mass shooting? This is what our police officers do every day. And you have a responsibility to acknowledge injustice when you see it. But when the facts are more complicated, like in this case where the girl was not holding a knife, but actually wielding that knife, to not get ahead of the facts, not portray it in a certain way. This is the seat of our federal government, and to demonize an individual before the facts are out is just deeply irresponsible.
Kilmeade, taking Kaylee's point a step further, that officer here had 9 seconds upon arriving to the scene and asking what's going on to see through a violent confrontation that culminated with a teenager lunging at another.
The 911 called, come quick. There's a guy, I'm going to get stabbed, there's a knife. So he comes quick, and they're saying, why did you do that? Well, that's what he was trained to do. I've talked to more officers in the last 24 hours than maybe I did in the last 24 days, and not one of them said the officer was wrong. So I'm curious. I'm willing to say I don't know. Why is everyone else not willing to say that, including Jen Psaki in one of the most important positions in this country?
And Kennedy, Jen Psaki joins a huge list of people who have, yes, jumped in and made it about race. So, for example, Valerie Jarrett tweeted here, a black teenage girl named Micaiah Bryant was killed because a police officer immediately decided to shoot her multiple times in order to break up a knife fight. Demand accountability, fight for justice, hashtag Black Lives Matter, to which there was a huge reaction to that on Twitter. Among them, Francis Joseph Beckwith, who says it's not a knife fight when one person lunges with a knife at another person who is unarmed. It's called attempted stabbing. Illustration, Lincoln was not in a gunfight with John Wilkes Booth. Kennedy, your reaction.
So it's kind of gross and cowardly to try and only abstract the moment that the police officer shot her, because I look at these girls and I think about the girl who was pinned against the car, who was being lunged at and essentially abandoned and failed on every level because of the pandemic. And I look at her, and obviously this girl had been failed so many times by her family and by schools and by systems. One can only assume. And I think that is part of the complex story that no one wants to touch on. And it's really, really important. And we have to ask ourselves, how are we failing these kids before they get to this point?
Harris, Kennedy asks such good questions and illustrates that this is a complex issue that reduces or has been reduced to this oversimplification, reduced simply about race. Your thoughts?
Look, you ask a previous question, I'll hit that one first and then I'll come to this, or maybe they tie together. Why won't Jen Psaki or the administration look at this and just call balls and strikes until we know more about the game, the whole investigation? Because they're afraid. They're cowardly in the face of the woke crowd. It's not that they don't know what the answer is. The answer is we wait for the facts. Like, a child knows the answer. But what is the right answer when you're, A, trying to use it to leverage it for politics, Congresswoman Waters, and maybe even President Biden, because he spoke before the verdict in the Chauvin trial. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's, well, we're searching for the right answer in terms of letting this play out, but also shoring up the narrative among those people, those Democrats who want to defund the police, so we want to be part of that. I mean, politics is part of everything, and that is what is so dirty and so hurtful in this whole thing. If if you can't be helpful, don't say anything. But you could be helpful by saying something like, tragedy for this child's family. Imagine what they're going through. She's in foster care. That's another family that has been hurt in this tragedy as well. We have to wait for the facts. And how did that 16-year-old get to the point where she thought her only option was to wield a knife? There are a lot of other questions. The neighbor whose garage cam that I just interviewed a few minutes ago caught this from a different perspective and had a lot of audio on it. So you really get the impact of the 9 seconds as they tick down. We're done. Like that. I mean, it's quick. And that cop, so there's not, I've been talking to cops like Brian. So, Brian, I'm being told that there wasn't time for a taser to hit this accurately, not hit the target of the car maybe or something. There just wasn't time for a taser. And the distance was the other issue. So there are just so many more questions. And then you've got to interview this officer and see what his perspective was. It's too soon for the White House to weigh in, but they can't help themselves, apparently.
Right. Kaylee, I'll give you the last final word just to talk about and bring us home that as all of Americans are looking to the White House for leadership during this time, and Americans are humans, which means we're not put or fit into these singular boxes. What's your last piece of advice or your statement to the White House today?
Well, look, let's play out a counterfactual. If that young girl had stabbed an innocent young girl who would have died, would we have heard about this from the White House podium? No. Would Valerie Jarrett be tweeting if this was a different scenario where the innocent young girl was a victim of stabbing, crime by another civilian? No, she wouldn't be tweeting. Would we hear about this as a national news story? No, because guess what? It's not the narrative that fits the left, which is crime in the streets, which has soared. I, from the White House podium, talked about Sequoia Turner and Legend Talaferro and these little babies who lost their lives. And we've seen a doubling in shootings of innocent individuals among children in the last year. So they've got to mention the other side of this. And tragically, if the innocent girl would have lost her life, this wouldn't be a story. Jen Psaki wouldn't be speaking about it from the podium.
Thank you, Kaylee. All right, Fox News alert for you. Just moments ago, the House approved a bill to make D.C. the 51st state in America. Democrats call the move a civil rights issue. Now, Republicans are calling it a wild power grab. More on this breaking news next.
You kind of have to wonder, other than a pure power grab by the left, what's the real rationale for this?
News is breaking. Democrats have pushed for D.C. statehood in high gear, and now the House has just voted to pass it. The vote sets up a historic showdown now in the Senate because the filibuster is still in place for now. So that's ramping up the Democrats' fight to end the filibuster, as you might imagine, which the GOP sees as part of a wild power grab. Senator Kennedy told me last hour that the effort to make D.C. a 51st state is unconstitutional, plain and simple.
This issue was settled in 1790. Our founders did not want the seat of the federal government to be influenced by any particular state, so they created a District of Columbia, a non-state. I'm not especially worried about it. I think it's anybody who knows a law book from a J. Crew catalog knows it's unconstitutional.
Brian Kilmeade, your thoughts, your reaction first to the senator.
Well, first off, I did not know J. Crew had a catalog, because I always just read the Sears catalog, so he caught me by surprise there. But the final vote was 216 to 208. It was pure party lines. And as usual, there's no way this should be done. This is done for one reason, not to give the constituents of Washington, D.C. representation in this country. It is to give Democrats 2 more Senate seats and a congressional seat. That is it. There's 700,000 people. It's abundantly clear what was meant in the Constitution. I am not overwhelmingly convinced the courts are going to turn it the right direction. Should, in fact, the filibuster blow up and they blow up the House. But I'll say this. Evidently, in this report, we're obviously doing this show and you doing your show, but Congressman Mondaire Jones, a new member of the squad, came out and said Republicans don't want Washington to be a state because there's not enough white people in it. It's amazing to me that they find race in everything. Immediately it caused an uproar. They want it struck from the record. I just don't think this is a black and white issue. I think this is a right and wrong issue. And I'm just amazed how race has to be in every single thing we discuss.
I don't know how they're going to have any friends anywhere, not just on Capitol Hill, but anywhere where serious matters are being discussed.
They're not looking for friends. It's looking for a political advantage. That's it.
But in life, I mean, if you accuse everybody who doesn't agree with you of being racist, where does that leave us? It's just so incredibly sad and destructive. Because then, when there's actual racism, it's like the little boy who cried wolf. Let me just stop. Kennedy.
So here's my problem with it. Unlike many people in this country, particularly athletes and lefty pundits, I love our flag. And I love the 50 nifty states. I love the song. I don't want to have to change the flag. I don't want to have to amend the song. And also, if you're concerned about people of color and policing right now, that's obviously a huge issue. All you're doing is introducing a new layer of police. Now you're going to have state police. So that is not looking out for communities of color in Washington, D.C. And also, you can have people who live in residential districts in D.C. vote in Maryland. There are ways of doing this, but also what the senator was talking about is there is a part of the Constitution that is carved out for D.C. It's not like, you know, Hawaii was up for sale, so we just snatched it at the dollar store. This is something that has its home in a constitutional nest. So that's why they're talking about an amendment.
Kaylee.
That's exactly right. Kennedy's right on that. But look, making the swamp the 51st state is exactly what Brian said, just an attempt to grab power, to make D.C. a Democrat stronghold. When you look at the numbers, George Will went through them in the Washington Post. You had Reagan, who won almost all 50 states, came within 3,000 votes of doing so, but yet he got 14% of the District of Columbia. President Trump got 5%. They know that this is a Democrat stronghold. It's the key to power, just like H.R. 1. But it's also unconstitutional. So filibuster gets in the way, get rid of it. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, the Enclave Clause, which has a special carve-out for D.C., get rid of it. It's destructive, but just another step of Democrats destroying institutions, whether it be the Electoral College, the filibuster, or seizing power from the states and federalizing elections.
Yeah, and you know, Kaylee, as you're talking about that, it makes me wonder even more which part of the party is in charge. And you're right. Moncler Jones has joined. I mean, the squad isn't all women anymore. I mean, there's some far left members of that. And I guess technically Senator Markey has always kind of been there, too, because he wrote the Green New Deal with AOC, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. But who's in charge here and who's capitulating? Are the moderates? Are Biden? I don't know if you necessarily call him a moderate. But really, who's running the show and how much more is there to come? Emily?
Right. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find people that actually believe he's a moderate now. He keeps relying on that, his 47 past years of experience as such. But it seems that our memories are longer than his because now he's just a mouthpiece for the far left. Kaylee brought up the filibuster, and even the House Majority Leader says, yeah, it needs to be jettisoned because it's not a democratic principle that the minority can stop the majority. But that's exactly why it was designed, so that there is a voice, a stronghold against the tyranny of the majority. The majority is not always right. So that was actually to protect the minority. And it seems to me that this is such a shiny object created that is distracting the entire country from the issues that really need our attention, while the Democrats are patting themselves on the back for introducing legislation to pack the court to create a state. I think people just want their kids back in school. I think people want their achievement gap closed. I think there needs to be an element of success, their livelihoods restored, rather than this ridiculous shell game that these guys are playing with themselves on the Hill.
Wow, very well put. Okay, just ahead, LeBron James. Republican Senator Ted Cruz says this type of reaction is getting to be all too common.
This is a pattern where the left consistently goes after, attacks, and demonizes police officers, and they do so often before the facts are known, often before there's any evidence of what happened. In this instance, your next could certainly be interpreted by some even as a call for violence, and I think it was a grossly irresponsible message for LeBron James to send out.
Brian, in all of your years of covering sports and being involved in sports, I'm curious to know your take on how this affects other athletes. To have someone of LeBron James' stature come out like this, be stupid enough to think that he can delete a tweet that we can't see. And what does that mean? Why isn't the commissioner saying anything, if in fact it's interpreted as violent or just not helpful?
Harris, he's running the league. LeBron James run. Why is he even on Twitter? Because if you go out and threaten somebody, I thought you get banned from Twitter. Didn't we learn that?
Yeah,
Suddenly,
at least.
you know, I'm still waiting to read that Hunter Biden story, and I don't think anyone there was anything violent about that. But he came down and said, anger does not do anyone good. My anger is still here for what happened to that girl. My sympathy for her and her family. Justice will prevail. But I just think it's blatantly irresponsible and went out to 50 million people. But if you watch ESPN and the others, they lead every single sports center with athletes speaking out what a racist society we are. There is no balance anywhere there in sports. And their ratings are down 40% on TNT. They're down 40% on ABC and 20% on ESPN. And I think these things are related. People want a break.
Wow. Kennedy.
I don't want to hear from LeBron James. I don't want to hear from LeBron James because he's basically condoned genocide of the Uyghurs in China, and his actions on China have been utterly reprehensible. And those are people who are being sterilized and raped and slaughtered and put in concentration camps. And, you know, to me, that's a really emotional issue. That's number one. Number two, he is by far not near one of the greatest Lakers ever. He will never be Kobe. He will never be Shaq. And I would much rather hear from Shaq because he was a cop. And I would much rather hear from him, you know, not only his high profile, but the love he has for his community, but also having worn the badge and knowing what he does about law enforcement. That's the kind of athlete. And I don't know, LeBron is getting old, and he's going to become Mr. Pump Fake here pretty soon.
I'm always curious when I hear anyone of color say something like what he tweeted. They always use our words. Our who? Who does he represent exactly in this country? We're not monolithic as people of color, as blacks, African Americans, whatever you want to call us. We're not. We don't all think the same. You can't speak for one. In fact, we've seen protesting that had no leadership on the ground since last summer. So there's not even anybody volunteering to speak up for the whole quote-unquote black community, even though there are many communities of color. Kaylee.
Yeah, that's right. And he said that because he's desperate to find a way to blame others for his heinous tweet and his mistake. I agree with Kennedy. I'd rather hear from Shaquille O'Neal, the great Shaq. That aside, with LeBron James, you know, he had the audacity to mention accountability. I would like to see accountability for a leftist saying something wholly inappropriate, putting a target on the back of a police officer. For a moment, think that this was not some celebrity athlete from the left, LeBron James. Let's say his name was LeBron Trump and he was a right-wing activist. He would be banned from Twitter. He would lose his job, likely, all of his sponsorships, and he would be relegated to the outskirts of society. There is one standard for the left and another standard for the right, and this just makes it crystal clear with no retribution here from Twitter for that appalling tweet.
So, Emily, I want to lean on your legal acumen now, because this has become a trend. Congresswoman Maxine Waters and her incendiary comments on the ground in Minneapolis right before a verdict in the Derek Chauvin case, calling for protesters to stay on the streets and get more confrontational. This tweet that LeBron thinks that he can wipe away by deleting, even though most people would snapshot it the second you thought it, because most people didn't even believe it was him. You know, his tweet that is also incendiary. Even if you don't take every word of it to mean violence, then why did you put that hourglass emoji up there? Like, what's that all about? I mean, how does the law look at stuff like this? Forget about Twitter. They're probably not going to suspend his account because they're fans, whatever. But you're really not allowed to yell fire in a crowded theater where there is no fire. That's not protected speech.
Right. And so to answer your question, you know, legally, all threats are taken seriously. And really, if they're actually actionable, is there sort of the wheels are put in motion. And I think there, you know, there's a criminal element to inchoate crimes. You can incite something without there actually be that horrible result that you call for. In the civil arena, you'd have to have damages for it. But I think that the larger conversation is such that why are some threats acceptable and some aren't? When does a threat become real? If people are putting put in fear regardless, especially from someone so influential, then that's a real impact. And quick point, if I may, based on just taking Kennedy's ball a bit further there. Remember when the general manager of the Rockets just said, "I stand with Hong Kong"? He just tweeted that. There was a firestorm. The owner of the Rockets distanced himself from him. The general manager had to apologize. Eventually, he resigned. There were high-profile athletes that publicly tweeted apologies to China. The disparate reaction here, as compared with theirs, so mind-boggling, and it's so ridiculous to see how apparently money is simply the driving factor that gets everyone on board when you have things like this. Again, going back to that Derek Chauvin trial as well, remember the prosecution. It's so easy, it's so simple to say we support law enforcement and we don't support aberrant actions, which this isn't. But I think that there illustrates the fact that you can support both. You can take that human approach without vilifying all of law enforcement.
Look, 19% of law enforcement in America are former military. And we're seeing growing numbers of people of color, racial minorities making up police departments across the country. So where do we go when we reach some sort of a balance there? How will LeBron James characterize policing in America if he can't make it about race? I want your last thought, Brian.
My last thought is this. LeBron James has to take a step back. They all have to take a step back there to get reined in. On your point, Emily, that you just brought up, not only when the Rockets owner came out and said, I support Hong Kong, China banned the NBA, and LeBron was critical of the GM, who basically he called him ignorant, not understanding business. And then the NBA cut a deal, we don't know the details of it, to get back in China. So now they're seeing China. So they sold their soul for billions.
Wow. Okay. For something as green as my dress. Cash. We'll move on. Up next, critics accusing...
After anchor Lester Holt said, we don't necessarily need to hear both sides to define truth. Watch.
I think it's become clearer that fairness is overrated. The idea that we should always give two sides equal weight and merit does not reflect the world we find ourselves in. That the sun sets in the west is a fact. Any contrary view does not deserve our time or attention. Decisions to not give unsupported arguments equal time are not a dereliction of journalistic responsibility or some kind of agenda. In fact, it's just the opposite.
Kennedy, he says it's just the opposite. It's not a dereliction of duty to ignore the other side. In fact, the dereliction occurs when you include it. Here, they are omitting the facts. Your thoughts?
They are, and he is employing so many fallacies here. They should petition him for a $15 an hour minimum wage. This is ridiculous because he's giving an example, an objective example. Yet the problem is there's so much subjectivity in the way they report the news, and so much subjectivity in the facts that they choose to abstract from certain stories. So conflating the two is not only disingenuous, it's completely dishonest. And it's much harder work to present facts and to do analysis. And if you only have to do half of that work, man, that's an easy day. No wonder his ratings suck.
And Harris, the stakes here are really high. It's arguably life and death situations with law enforcement now having targets on their back. This isn't just presenting two sides of an opinion of a policy. This is a really serious matter that he now and NBC now is omitting facts about.
So you know what I really like about this? I like to know who people really are. What I don't want to do is find out when it's too late. And he just showed us who he and his team are. Aren't you glad you know? Look, there's one thing. It's a mistake. I make them. Teams that I'm part of make them. That's one thing. But when you go on the air and say that fairness is overrated and that you don't value the truth, that's basically what he's saying. And there is a difference between gathering facts as a journalist and reporting the whole truth, which is why when I had the neighbor on last hour exclusively who got this from his garage camera, I didn't just dissect the new video that we had from his perspective. He and his wife could hear what was going on moments up, because that's part of the story we don't have. That's the facts with context. So these girls have been arguing. You heard them drop a few expletives. Now tell me more about what you thought you saw. Leading up, camera hadn't gone off yet because the squad car pulled up, and that's what triggered the camera. Okay, so there were some things that they'd been out there for a while. That's the facts with context. That's the truth. Apparently, Lester Holt is only interested in getting part of the story. Good luck with that. I don't want to see that. That's like watching something that doesn't have a whole script in it. Like, what's the end of the movie? I don't know. Lester Holt cut it off at 42 minutes.
And Kilmeade, imagine if that was this network. Where's the accountability for the left, and why is it somehow acceptable for the manipulation of that mainstream media of reality?
First off, on what Harris was referencing about we all make mistakes, I checked my Wikipedia, Harris. I haven't made any. So if this show goes well, I'm going to continue my perfect game.
Don't you tease me. You know I have one.
All right, okay, I know. I think it's very interesting. Lester Holt said holding a knife. The other network said wielding a knife, which is more accurate because it's a threatening motion, so leaving it out. How about this, a perfect storm? What if LeBron James read the Washington Post, the New York Times, and then NBC, and watched NBC, and then tweeted that out erroneously, not knowing the whole story? That's the problem. What if those people on the streets did not know the whole problem? What if those kids at Ohio State who don't want cops to come on campus anymore didn't know the whole story because they looked at these other, what they think is reliable outlets? Do you see how it all builds on each other, and then towns burn and stores go up in flames?
Right, Kaylee, that was part of the Nicholas Sandmann situation with the Washington Post, which is that the amplification was just as problematic and legally actionable as the actual printing. Your thoughts on this?
Very good point. Look, we began this by talking about the political elite demonizing this officer. We moved into the Hollywood athlete elite demonizing this officer. And here we are with the media committing journalistic malpractice, demonizing this officer. Put it all together, it's what Jason Whitlock said. The global elite are trying to play us all, divide us against one another, and position us against authority and institutions. It's ridiculous, and it should be seen and called out for what it is.
Which we are doing here. All right, guys, just